Welcome to the Happy Rebel podcast, where we explore the realms of finding your calling, living your values, and doing the work of self-healing. Through candid conversations with fellow seekers, we'll uncover ideas and concepts that challenge, expand, and empower us to embrace our authentic selves and live with intention. Hi there, I'm Kelly Street, owner of Happy Rebel and your guide on this journey. I'm known for my insatiable curiosity and tendency for pushing boundaries. I've always been a challenger, eager to question the status quo and explore the uncharted territories of personal growth. So join me as we navigate the twists and turns of life's journey, seeking out the wisdom and insights that illuminate our path towards fulfillment and rebellion against the ordinary. Before we get started, I want to remind you to connect with me on Instagram at Happy Rebel, where you can ask questions and share your thoughts. Remember, you are never alone on your path to becoming a happy rebel. This is the Happy Rebel Podcast. As we enter the space of the Happy Rebel podcast, I invite you to gently focus your eyes, or if possible, allow your eyes to be fully closed. Take a deep, cleansing breath and exhale to ground into your body. Inhale deeply, visualizing a golden light in your heart center. With each exhale, imagine that light growing stronger and brighter. Continue breathing as you prepare to honor the complexities of life, embracing the balance between the light and the dark of your own experiences and the conversation to come. With gratitude for this moment of grounding and connection, slowly open your eyes as we begin this podcast adventure together. Hi, Katy. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to chat with you.
I am so excited to talk with you too. I have followed you on Instagram for years now and your journey and your story. And so I'm really excited for people to hear more about you. So why don't you introduce yourself? Tell everybody who you are and what you're all about.
Sure. So I am Katy Seppi, and I run the Childless Collective, which is support and community for people who wanted to have kids and couldn't for a number of reasons. And my background is actually in social work, specifically in like community and like community building and policy. And I went from having a career in that to switching over full time 2 years ago to working with the childless community. And it's been incredible and I love it. And that's what I do now.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I have seen that journey from you going to just, I think, an influencer, what I would call an influencer in the child-free or post-fertility, infertility community, and to now doing this full time. And I find what you do to be such an inspiration and to be something that's brought me a lot of comfort as I've kind of moved through my own infertility journey. So I would love if you would talk a little bit more about what your collective does and maybe a little bit more about who you serve.
Yeah, definitely. And I just have to say, I kind of hate the word influencer because I definitely don't consider myself an influencer. I've always started with the aim of making connections. It's why I started my account and what I do. So for me, it really is about the community building and getting to meet other people who share my experience. So the Childless Collective, it encompasses really just all the work that I do within the childless community. The main piece of it is the online community that I host. So it was actually started by Jody Day, who is also in the Childless Not by Choice community. And she's had it going for a few years before I came in as the new host. So I've been doing that the last 2 years, but it's a private online community. We have about 750 members, and it's just a space where people can talk about all the different ways that being childless impacts their life. So we have people who are brand new to this, where they're just realizing that they're not going to have kids and like working on letting go of that dream. And we've got people who, are decades out from finding out and who are there for connection and the support and all of that too. So it's got a great range of experiences and ages and all kinds of things. But it's specifically for women and non-binary people. And it's a really beautiful space. We've got forums and we host a lot of like online events. And then depending on what community you live in. We have some areas where we have enough members that we do. We have local hosts that host like in-person events too, like meetups and stuff. So it's really fun. I love it. I also do online summits and did my first in-person summit this year. And I think I'll be taking a break from those for a little while, but those have been really fun to host too. So
yeah, doing a big in-person event, I imagine that was just like a crazy amount of work.
It was beyond. Yes. I don't know if I'll be able to do it again, but it was a great experience.
Yeah. I just can only imagine how powerful that would be to be not just even in the online community, but in person with all these people who maybe they have a different experience than you. Maybe they have a similar, and just to connect on what it's like to be child-free, not by choice.
Yeah. I mean, it was really cool, especially I think a lot of the feedback that I got was just that people didn't realize how easily they could just breathe, like knowing that no one was going to ask them if they had kids or ask them about like that part of their lives, and that they were in a space where everybody understood the experience that they have of being childless. And I think it really just goes to show like how bombarded we are, especially as women. You know, a lot of times when I meet someone new, the first question I get asked is if I have kids or how old are your kids? Like you're fielding questions about your fertility and parenthood status all the time. And yeah, so it was really cool to just have that shared space of like, wow, I'm in a room with like 100 other people and nobody's a parent, and no one's going to talk about that or ask me questions about it. So it was really cool to have that. I think it's very rare in our society. If you're in a group of even like, 5 people, your odds are going to be that you are going to be the only person who doesn't have kids, or maybe one other. So it's just really rare. It was cool.
Yeah. I assume that I got this from you, and maybe you remember everything you posted, probably not, but I got this from somewhere and it was really impactful to me. All the things you can ask someone when you first meet them that aren't about either kids or job, because sometimes for people, the job is also a really sensitive thing as well. And I think it was you that posted this, but just asking things like, what keeps you busy? What do you enjoy doing for fun? Like asking other things that aren't about potentially inflammatory issues or things that could be really hard for someone to answer in that moment.
Yep, totally. I don't know if that was me. It might have been somebody else, but it's really good advice, I think. Like I've even had someone say, I wish people would just ask me like, or say like, tell me about your family. That's a very different question than like, do you have kids? And it also is inclusive of people who are single. They, because it may mean their family of origin, or maybe their chosen family. So yeah, I think there are small tweaks that people can make that are just add a bit of like sensitivity to those conversations, which I think is really important.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. So I know one of the things that you kind of already mentioned is just a big part of the work you do is really helping people, creating space for people to let go of the dream of parenthood. Mm-hmm. So I was just going to say, what does that process look like? But I think that process is so different for everybody that it's not just going to look the same. But what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it looks different for everybody because people come from different circumstances and they have different life experiences that change how they view it and process all of it. So yeah, I think it's different for everyone, but I do think that I have found there are a few things that are similar amongst our experience. The biggest one I think is getting hit with just massive amounts of grief and having to figure out how to process and navigate that, especially when it's a grief that may not really be seen or validated by people around you, mm-hmm. that it can be a kind of a lonely process, and one that, I mean, for me, I actually spent a few years not realizing that it was grief and not being able to give a name to it. And it was through other people who had already created like their own body of work within the childless community that I was able to pull from and have language for it and be like, oh, I'm grieving. This is normal. And it makes sense that I'm grieving because I lost this dream that I had. And that also means that the future I had envisioned for myself is also gone now. And I don't have anything in my mind to like replace it with, because I've never thought about what my future would look like without kids. And, you know, it led to so much around identity work and grieving and envisioning a new future and navigating relationships in a different way. Like it just, I feel like it hit so many different parts of my life, and I think does for a lot of people experiencing it, that it becomes kind of something that is an identity that you'll hold for the rest of your life. And while there's ways to like integrate it, it's more complicated, I think, than just like this thing happened, then you get over it and you do something else. It's pretty complicated. So I would say some of the top themes that come up in like the community that I work in are, you know, definitely grief is like a huge one, how to manage and navigate. And manage it isn't really the right word, but like, how do you navigate it? How do you process it? What does it look like? And then I think a lot of it is around the identity piece too, of like, how do I envision a new future? What is this going to look like for me? And then I would say the next big one is like just navigating in a society that assumes you have kids and assumes everyone has kids and is going to treat you that way. So I would say those are some things that pretty much anyone who's childless not by choice is going to have in common.
Yes. Yeah. I think that one of the things that is a big piece for me, or that feels really present, is that societal expectations, or just the mentality, the judgments that people will make, either because they judge assuming that everyone has kids. And so it's like, you know, how old are your kids, or any of those things, or oh, well, that must be nice, all the free time you have.
Right. Yeah.
I know you've done some work too on kind of identifying those things, or identifying what responses people could have to those conversations, and to not just how to start a conversation with someone and ask about different things other than having children, but also just responses that set a healthy boundary and also close the door on like, this isn't a conversation I'm willing to have with you, stranger.
Yes, absolutely. Or we need to shift how we're having this conversation, dear friend or family member. Like, you know, it's like, yeah, the strangers is one thing. And I think those have like some techniques that I have learned over the years to help me manage those conversations. But it's a really different thing if like people that you're close to in your life or people that you see regularly, like coworkers or, you know, your friends, your family members. Those conversations, I think, can be even more painful than sometimes than the ones that we have with strangers, because they're ongoing parts of our relationship, and they can be really challenging. So that definitely comes up a lot within the community too, of like how to navigate not just those like quick interactions you have with strangers, but just also the really important relationships to you, and how are those happening? Because, you know, people are going to have their own thoughts about it that are close to you too, and those can come up in some really difficult ways, I think, to manage. So
yes, absolutely. So before we started recording, we were talking about, you brought up this concept that I wrote down because it really hit for me, was the idea of disenfranchised grief. And I also think that sometimes maybe that's partnered with prolonged grief, and that they're both. So can you explain what disenfranchised grief is?
yeah, I mean, the short of it is it's basically grief that isn't recognized by society or maybe by the people around you. So your internal experience, you're having grief, you're feeling it, but no one else around you seems to really see it or validate it. And it can make it really lonely. Like I've heard people say that, you know, childless people say like, you know, when I lost a parent or like, you know, lost someone close to me, the reaction was so physical and obvious, where people were sending me things and, you know, giving me their condolences. And like I think there are ways that we are taught how to show up, like ritualistically, or like, you know, it's just like, okay, if someone loses someone close to them, it's still awkward, right? Like we don't always know what to say. We don't always know what to do, but we at least have some guidance of like, I could send them flowers, or I could like give them a gift card to have someone help clean up their house this week so they don't have to do it. Or I could send them like a really nice note, or let them know I'm thinking about them, or stock their freezer full of like casseroles so they don't have to cook for a month, or whatever it is. Like we have some ideas of like, how could I be of support to this person and what would they be needing? And I think for disenfranchised grief, a lot of it is just done really silently, where it's people aren't having those same reactions to it and aren't necessarily like knowing how to show up for you, or even that they need to show up for you, because it's kind of like a non-event to the people around you.
Yes. Yeah. Whether it's realizing that you no longer have enough ovarian reserve to be able to use your own eggs, or whether, whatever it might be, it feels like it's all of these invisible ways that there are all of these little steps along the way to mourn that are hard to explain to other people. Yeah. It's hard for the majority of our society to understand the impact that a failed embryo transfer has, or that just even any sort of a setback, or being single and having a relationship not work out and then being like, oh, this feels like it was my last chance at having a child.
Yeah. I think that's so true. And I think, you mentioned like prolonged grief. I think one thing that I've realized from being in the community is that for a lot of people, I think their grief around being childless like shifts and morphs, and at some point like isn't quite as present. For some it is, but everyone has their different relationship to grief. But I think one thing that is kind of consistent is that most people have some kind of moments throughout their life that might bring up those feelings at certain times. Yeah. And that's something that I think can be hard for like friends and family to understand or know how to navigate with you, or even see. So, a good example of this might be that, maybe you are 10 years out from realizing that you're not going to have kids, and for the most part, you're like doing great. But when you go to your family's like Christmas Day or whatever, that is like a landmine of all kinds of things that might bring up grief for you, and that might be really challenging in ways that maybe your family members like treat you differently because you don't have kids than like maybe your siblings that have kids, or whatever it is. A lot of times I think there's an assumption that if it happened a long time ago, the person's just like over it. And I think that there's some, I'm going to say simple ways, and then I question it, but I do think some of them are kind of simple, of like how you could like tweak things or do things a little bit differently that might feel better to the person who is experiencing grief during those times. But yeah, I think that's a hard one, because it is kind of a lifelong one. And it's one that if I look at like what questions come up or what situations come up that people are looking for advice for within the online community that I host, so many of them are around navigating things like that, and navigating their relationships, and how they've changed, or how they're treated, or how to maintain their friendships with their friends who become moms. Like all of it is the relationships piece is so much more complicated than I would have ever guessed. Like when I realized I'd be childless, I knew the grief was going to be horrendous, because I was like, this is all I've always wanted to be a mom. I couldn't picture my life any other way. I knew the grief was just going to be massive, but I did not expect those layers of how like, I don't know, it's just like these extra ways that you have to process and navigate things in regards to like other relationships or society. And that adds a whole nother layer that stays with you your whole life, because it's always confronting you. You don't get to just like take a break from it. It's just there all the time, everywhere. So I think that's the part I was really like not expecting or prepared for.
Yes, it hits at different moments. Speaking of, the other day, my husband and I just sat down to like watch a comedy show, and it was like great. And the first 4 minutes of this comedy show were all about how the comedian's friends are all having children, and she doesn't want to have children, and how annoying that is. And, just kind of on and on about all of these elements. And then the kicker was, she said, well, and then for a lot of people out there, even if you want to have children, you can't do it. And at that point, my husband just like turned it off and he was like, yep, we're done with this. This is not something that we need to put ourselves through right now. And it's just where you least expect it. Kind of everywhere you turn, there can be these moments that bring it up, which I'm sure is, I've been fortunate not to lose a parent at this point. And I have many close friends who have lost one or both of their parents. And I think it's kind of a similar experience where that wave of grief just comes back up and all of a sudden you're like, whoa, okay, I was just sitting here watching TV. I didn't expect to be in tears.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So you said you have some ways that people can navigate those situations, like a family Christmas that gets really uncomfortable. What are some of your suggestions for how to make it through those times?
Well, for the person experiencing it, this is so complicated. I'll give the example of maybe just like a Christmas day with family, even though that, and not everyone celebrates Christmas either, but like for ease of like trying to think of an example, I'll just stick with this for a minute. So for a lot of people, it's about giving yourself some distance and space in ways that can make room for that grief when it shows up so that you have time to kind of process it and give it some space. So that could look like maybe you typically stay, if you live out of town, maybe you typically stay with a sibling or with a parent. Maybe this trip this year, getting a hotel room so that you have your own space to kind of go back to when you need to. And if you aren't able to do that, giving yourself permission to maybe like, hey, I need to go run an errand, or I'm going to go for a walk, or I'm going to go do something that gives you some space to just be on your own for a bit so that you have some time away from, everything that's going on, and you can give space to the fact that like maybe everything's not feeling great and you need that time to just honor your grief and sit with it and give room for that too. So I know like a lot of churches do like, what do they call them, like blue Christmas nights the night before. So like a lot of times there are opportunities to go to events like that are for people who are grieving around the holidays, to just give some space to that. We do like an all-day chat on Christmas that goes for over like 24 hours because we cover a ton of different time zones, but we basically have volunteers that show up in a live chat and you can just come and talk about whatever's on your mind, and it's open all day on Christmas. Like you can come in at any point and just hop in and say whatever it is that you want to say, or have other people who get it that you can talk with. I think some other things that I think are really helpful is remembering the things that like bring you joy out of tradition, and maybe like tweaking or adapting those things so that they're a better fit for who you are. Because a lot of traditions that we have around, especially like holidays or rituals that we have around them, are very centered on children. And a lot of times the whole day is going to be centered on, if there are like kids in your life, which is great. Like I want them to have the great Christmas, but it's such a reminder of what you don't have that can be really difficult. So one thing I found that seems to bring a lot of joy back to holidays for people is starting their own traditions or tweaking traditions that feel like a better fit for where they're at. So still doing stockings or getting like the matching outfits with you and your cat or whatever it is. Like a lot of childless people I've heard have said like, well, I don't feel like I can send out a Christmas card because I don't have a traditional family that is what the Christmas cards look like. And I'm like, one year I got a Christmas card from a friend who did it was a picture of her and her cat, and they both had like Santa hats on, and it was just an update about what the year had been like for them. And it was like my favorite card that I got all year. And so I think it's this idea that we don't matter as much. People aren't going to be as interested in us or our lives if we don't have partners or we don't have kids. And so I think being able to take that back, like it's been really fun in the community. I've been seeing people kind of take that back and feeling empowered to be like, I'm going to just send a picture of me, or I'm going to send a picture of just me and my partner, or like including pets or whatever. And those have been so fun to see. And I guarantee that like their friends and family love getting those in the mail. But I don't know. I think there's like this feeling of, I've got to hold back from celebrating or engaging with this holiday or holiday traditions because they're not made for me. And I think there's ways we can like tweak them to make them more appropriate for us and bring joy back into it. And then I also think like some of it is having tough conversations with friends and family members and figuring out like what you need or what they could tweak that might make you feel better engaging, and having some of those conversations in advance to see if there are things that you can do to make that go a little bit easier too.
Yeah. I remember, speaking of having conversations with friends and family, I remember there was at one point when there was a family baby shower a few years ago, and I was in a place where that just wasn't something I was interested in participating in. And I tried to have that conversation with a family member and just unfortunately didn't go well, wasn't received well. It was sort of like, well, this isn't about you. This is about, your cousin. And there's a lot of developing a thicker skin, and which I kind of hate that terminology, developing a thicker skin, but how do I want to say that differently? I think for me, it was more just like really sticking to my boundaries and being like, yep, actually I'm not trying to make this about me. This is just for me right now. This isn't a position I'm willing to put myself in. And in order to honor their day and their experience, I'm going to let them have that. So that I'm not sitting over there holding back tears the whole time, making it, obvious or uncomfortable that I don't want to be there.
Yep. That's a really good example. And I think definitely one that comes up in the infertility and childless communities a lot, like the baby showers thing. But I think that piece you said about boundaries is really important, because at some point you may need to decide what feels protective for you or what you do and don't want to participate in, or, there are times where you may need to put your own needs first, and being okay with that, being clear about it, and then realizing that not everyone's going to understand or respond in the way that you want to. I have had some very thoughtful conversations with people where I've thought in advance about how do I want to communicate this? What do I think is going to be received in the best way? And sometimes that's worked really wonderfully. And sometimes it's like it just completely was lost on the person, and the behavior is not going to change. And then I need to in turn decide well, how do I want to keep engaging with this person? And do I need to set different boundaries based on this conversation? So it is kind of an evolving thing that can be really difficult. But
yeah. And I think this is why I love what you do and the community that you've created, because there is something so powerful about finding people in the world who you can have a shared experience with, where, for me, I a few years ago, we moved from a big city where I maybe would have had more access to more people who were in a similar situation, or for me, one foot in both worlds, step parent and also child free in half of my life. And yet then moving to a small town where it is the first question, everybody asks that first question is oh, how many kids do you have, or whatever. And just really needing places and spaces where I could go to and find commonality or find common ground.
Mm-hmm. It's so important.
Yeah. So how do you see what you do or what your community is doing? How do you see it evolving over the next couple of years? What do you hope to bring in?
What a fun question. I don't know if anyone's asked me this, so this is fun. Okay. Well, I definitely have some bigger projects that I want to take on within the online community that I host specifically, that I think will really add to people's experience there. So I have some ideas for that, but I would say if I'm just thinking about the big childless community, not the online private community host, but just societally, what do I hope? I think one of the biggest things that has been on my mind is how little people understand or know about the experience of being childless not by choice. and how rarely we hear from people who are childless. Or so even with people within the childless community, sometimes I'll ask like, well, who's your favorite childless role model? And people are like, I don't know who's out there. And I think it's been like an invisible thing, I think, for a long time, because obviously like childless people have always existed, people who wanted kids and couldn't have them. But even when I started doing work with this community like 5 or 6 years ago, the biggest reason I started my Instagram account and my blog is because I didn't know anyone in my personal life who was childless not by choice, at least that I knew of, like that I could identify that way. Like the people who I knew who didn't have kids, it was by choice, which is a totally valid and awesome experience. But there's things that make it really different if you're having to like grieve something that you wanted and couldn't get to. So for me, I think that representation piece is really important. Like I couldn't find anyone when I looked on Instagram or I looked for blogs. There were a few people that I found. There were a few books that I found. There were like a handful of accounts on Instagram that I found, but it just felt so small. Like I was like, why aren't people like talking about this? Why aren't we having these conversations within like a public forum? And how do we connect to each other? And how do we help people who don't share our experience to understand a bit more about what we're going through? Because these are like our families and coworkers and, you know, family members, all these people that it would really benefit if they could understand a bit more about our experience. It would make our lives a bit easier. So for me, the big thing is representation. And I say that meaning having more of our stories and experiences out there. And also ones that show the full range of how someone may become childless not by choice. Because I think right now, a lot of the voices within the childless space are shared certain demographics. Like a lot of them have been through infertility. Most are married. Most are white, cisgendered, like straight. Like we are all those. It's not, and it's hard for me because I'm like, you know, there's so few voices that any voices that are out there are awesome, but there's so many experiences that aren't being represented or that we're still not hearing from, that I'm really hoping that will grow, that representation will grow. I would love to start seeing stories in the media, like for every story about this celebrity is 50 and just had their miracle baby. I would love to see more stories from people who wanted to have kids and couldn't, or went through infertility and didn't end up with a baby. We're not hearing those voices very often. And so I just think that for me, that's probably the biggest piece, is just representation. I want to see more of us out there and seeing it being talked about, not just within the childless community, but from a societal level.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember when Jennifer Aniston's experience came out and she was like, yeah, I am childless, not by choice. And it was just like the bomb dropped. And finally, I felt like, oh my God, people are finally going to realize that this is something that can happen even to someone like her, who has access to money and medical systems and has all of this perceived privilege, or, you know, real privilege as well. And yet even she didn't come out with a child. And it just felt like powerful and incredible, but also really sad that her story is kind of lost in the mix of, like you said, all of these miracle babies that are happening too.
Yes. And I think the other thing I noticed from that is that when you look at the headlines that came up in response to that article, like, so I can't remember which outlet covered the original story or ran the original story, but there were a whole bunch of follow-up articles talking about the story and what had come out from it. And what I found is that almost all of them, a lot of the headlines were like cautionary tale headlines of like, Jennifer Aniston says she wished she would have frozen her eggs, and it's like, well, okay, let's look at the article as a whole. Like I feel like so many of the headlines were like, this is what happens if you wait too long. This is how you could avoid this kind of thing. And that was such a bummer, especially because when I read the article, the part where she talks about having been through infertility treatments and them not working was like a pretty small part of the interview that got published, at least. And so much of what came after that was her describing the life that she's created after that and how much joy is in it. She talks about the really close friendships that she has and the time that she spends with them, and how, like, you know, the sisterhood that she has with these friends and all of the things that she's doing that bring her joy. And, you know, she says her life, she feels like a phoenix rising, that it was like this transformational thing for her, that she was able to like take something that was really difficult, but is in this space of having so much transformation and building a life that she really loves. And I didn't see a single like follow-up article that even mentioned any of that. It was all focused on her fertility journey and what she could have done differently. How could someone else avoid, you know, this happening to them? And it really felt like a missed opportunity. Like, even people in the infertility community of like people who are still trying, or people who run infertility accounts, most of the coverage I saw from them was, you know, like Jennifer finally talks about the fact that she went through infertility. And I think that became the crux of it.
Yeah.
And for me, I was like, what got missed is that this is a representation for people who are childless, not by choice. And no one's talking about that aspect of the article at all. Like, that's the part that's not being talked about. Everyone wants to talk about, I wonder what fertility treatment she had, or, you know, like, you should freeze your eggs or whatever it was. And it just felt like a missed opportunity to have a different kind of discussion.
Yeah. That's so good. I'm glad you spoke to that, because that is really important. And I think for me, sometimes that even gets lost on me, probably because I'm still in, you know, hopefully one way or the other, nearing the end of my fertility journey. But I think because I'm still in it, there is still the part of me that wants to attach to that aspect of it. But you're totally right. When I go back in my mind I read the whole article, or the whole thing, and I saw how much she also loves her dogs, and that she's done a lot of beautiful work in adopting dogs. And like, I could also see myself being so happy having like 4 dogs. My husband would not love that, but but like, just like having all these animals around too, and finding joy in other living creatures to care for, and to have them give so much back to me as well.
Yeah, totally. Or not. Like, I'm not a pet person. So for me, I'm like, I don't have any animals. I'm making it a point to specifically not have anything in my house that I have to care for, because that is, for me, one of the biggest like perks of not having kids, is that I don't have the same level of responsibility or care that I have to give to other people. And I can detach from that kind of caregiver nurturing role and just do what I want to do. Mm-hmm. And I know the flip side of that is people saying, yeah, because you're selfish and, you know, whatever. But the thing is, like, I really do value that. And it's become something I really lean into and enjoy and make the most of. And yeah, if people want to say that makes me selfish, I'm not hurting anyone, you know, like, to me, I'm like, what selfish is if you are in a role of being a caregiver for someone who's dependent on you, and you are not fulfilling that role or those obligations. Yeah. But like, I'm not hurting anyone. I'm not like, there's nobody I have responsibility over that I'm failing. I just am in a place where I do have more freedom and flexibility and choice of where I invest my time and energy. And that's really nice. And it's something I lean into, because when you're first realizing that you're not going to have kids, it is kind of hard to figure out, well, what are the perks? Because society is going to tell you, like, your ultimate fulfillment in life is to be married and have kids. Mm-hmm. And we don't have a lot of narratives around, well, where do you get meaning and fulfillment without children? Or where does your joy come from? What does your life look like? Yeah. So I think for me, I'm like, I'm going to find those things that bring me joy and that I can lean into and make the most of those.
Yeah. I love it that you don't even have any plants that you have to take care of. I love that. And I think there's something so beautiful and that gets overlooked in different people finding their paths that don't hurt anybody else, but that are working for them and fulfilling them, because that that gives something back to the world in its own way.
Yeah.
Because it's somebody who is happy and purposeful and joyful and just doing their thing. And that should be enough.
Yeah. And there is a lot around gender that comes into this too, because I don't know that men who don't have kids get as many comments around, well, you're selfish, or, well, who else are you going to care for, or who else are you nurturing? There is this, belief that our worth is tied to our nurturing or are nurturing something else. And that if, for some people, I know that it's something that they really connect to, and that it is big for them to be like, well, if I'm not a mom, I do want other ways to like have an outlet for like nurturing and caring and all of those things. And so no shame on that or judgment if that's what someone like really wants to find something else to channel that into. Totally valid. But I also think that there is like an association with our worth in society as women to say, well, if you're not a mom, you're not fulfilling your duty to the world. So what else are you caring for? What else are you nurturing? And so a lot of times it's like, well, okay, I'm not a mom, but I am a teacher. And so I'm giving to these kids, or I'm a social worker, I'm whatever it is. Like there's an expectation that we then move into some other kind of role that focuses on nurturing and caretaking. And so part of it is that I'm just really like, is it enough that we can just live our lives though too? Like, I don't know, does our worth have to be connected to taking care of something else? So yeah, I don't know. Brings up a lot of gendered stuff too, I think.
Yeah, it does for sure. I think that's where my bias showed up is like, oh, I could have 4 dogs instead, is the idea that, well, I have to be caring for something. It can't just be my stepdaughter and our dog and our chickens and being a good spouse. Like it has to also be all these other ways that I'm making up for the fact of not having like created a child. And that's bullshit. And we can call bullshit on it.
Yes, I will always call bullshit on it because it's really frustrating. And if someone like goes through this experience and they're like, well, I do want to adopt 4 dogs, then that's awesome too. Like whatever path you end up being on, like I want people to find whatever brings them like happiness and joy. And that can look so many different ways to so many different people. So yeah, again, like no judgment for anyone who like wants to turn that attention onto other things that they can nurture and create and support. But I do think that like there's an expectation on women that we find something else, another way to give that like nurturing energy to. And I feel like your plan doesn't have to include that either if you don't want it to. I
really, from the bottom of my heart, I thank you so much for giving me permission and space, and all of the other people who have followed you, who are part of your community, giving that permission and space to be able to say there could be another path that is filled with joy and that happiness can be present even if children are not there as well. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Oh, absolutely. And if you look at the research, there is no evidence that says that parents are happier than non-parents. So honestly, so much of it is just about our bias as a society. So, if I can spread that message and to help people see that they can be okay, in fact, even thriving and happy without kids, it's a narrative that's missing from our society, but it's one that exists in reality. And
yeah. Well, thank you so much for having this conversation with me today. And again, for doing all the work that you do. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being part of the Happy Rebel podcast community. Stay connected with us on Instagram at Happy Rebel. If you've enjoyed our episodes, please consider rating, liking, and reviewing the podcast. It truly does help us grow. Until next time, this is Kelly Street. Remember, embrace the dark and the light.